And then they offered a couple of arguments. They offered the argument that abortion had been prohibited virtually everywhere in the United States up until the mid-1960s, and that Texas's law was really no different than any other. And the Supreme Court didn't want to buy that argument, and there's a variety of reasons why they didn't buy it, and none of them are very good. But they rejected the sort of legal precedent argument. The other argument they offered was actually the facts of field development. Texas said, look, it's pretty clear that there's a continuity between the unborn human being and the postnatal human being. And that's the purpose of the statute. The Supreme Court didn't buy that, but the Supreme Court never deals with the actual evidence. This is what Justice Blackmun says. We need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins, when those trained in the respective disciplines of medicine, philosophy, and theology are unable to arrive at any consensus. The judiciary at this point in the development of man's knowledge is not in a position to speculate, unquote. A couple of interesting things about that quote. One is that that's probably the only time you'll ever hear a justice or a judge say that they're not going to make a judgment even when experts disagree. Because if you think about it, that's why people go to court, right? And I mean, it's sort of like Justice Blackmun, who wrote the opinion, is saying, gosh, there's just so many smart people who disagree. Who are we to judge? Right? Well, you're supposed to. You're the judge, right? And that's your role. But it was one of these rare cases where the court just simply didn't deal with it. But in a sense, they did deal with it. Let me explain what I mean. It gets to the heart of this kind of objection that we either don't know when life begins, or the state should remain neutral on the question because we quote unquote don't know. Now, the problem is to say that you don't know is actually, and then to permit abortion, is actually to make a statement about what you ought to believe about the unborn. That is, imagine if I said something like this. Let's say we're in the middle of the 19th century. In fact, if you ever read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, there are a number of places when Abraham Lincoln engages Stephen Douglas when they were both running for the U.S. Senate in, I think, 1856, was it? 1858. And of course, Lincoln lost that election, wound up being elected president in 1860. But in those debates, they discussed the issue of slavery. And one of the things that Stephen Douglas said was, look, I don't think there's anything, because I think slavery's wrong, but the state should have a right to vote up or down on it. And Lincoln's response is, you can't say that it's, on the one hand, wrong and at the same time permissible. Something can't be both permissible and impermissible at the same time. That is, Douglas was trying to have a kind of pro-choice position, right? I'm personally opposed to slavery, but if you want to own one, that's fine. But that actually says something about the nature of the people that are enslaved. It means that they're not made in the image of God and that they're not human persons. That's not a neutral point of view. So when the Supreme Court says, well, we're not going to make a judgment, but we're going to allow it to happen, that's making a judgment. It's in fact putting in place an understanding that says that the unborn are not full-fledged members of the human community, they ought not to be protected. The other problem with that, at least the legal aspect of the opinion, is that Blackmun says elsewhere in his opinion that if the state of Texas could prove that the unborn is a person under the 14th Amendment, that means that Texas's statute stands and there is no actually, they don't even need a statute, right? I mean, the 14th Amendment is enough to protect the unborn. Now, the irony is that by saying that we're not going to make a judgment as to whether the unborn is a person or not, in a way, Blackmun is conceding that the most important premise is not known. That is, he's saying, if the state of Texas can show that the unborn is a person of the 14th Amendment, then there is no right to abortion. But remember, Blackmun says we don't know, which means that he didn't prove that it isn't a person, which means that not only do you not get fetal personhood, you don't even really get a right to abortion either. And so at the end of the day, one of the reasons why Roe v. Wade gets so harshly criticized, not only by people that are pro-life, but even people that support abortion rights, is this kind of sloppy thinking throughout it, where the court just simply ignores its own understanding or its own premises in different places. Later on, the Supreme Court, in a case called Casey versus Planned Parenthood, upholds Roe v. Wade, but winds up gutting it of any of the justification that it had used in Roe. And at the end of the day, what the Supreme Court says in Casey, in fact, I'm teaching a class this semester at Baylor called Philosophy and the Constitution, and we just went over Casey, and my students are actually stunned. They said, basically, they threw Roe v. Wade under the bus, and yet at the same time upheld the right to abortion. That's precisely what happened. What the three justices who wrote the plurality opinion, Souter, Kennedy, and O'Connor, said was this: we have to uphold Roe v. Wade, even though every justification for it probably can be challenged. That is, even if there was error. There's actually a quote in Casey. Even if there was error in Roe v. Wade, we have to uphold it. Why? Stare decisis. That is, we have to uphold precedent, which has only been around for 19 years. Not very long precedent. And the other was, part of that stare decisis justification was the fact that the court said it had to protect its own integrity. And the other was what is called the reliance interest. For those who are lawyers, you know, the reliance interest usually applies to contract law, but it was applied here in this sense. People have arranged their lives around the right to abortion. And because of that, the court cannot overturn Roe v. Wade. So essentially what we have in Roe v. Wade, in Casey, is upholding Roe while abandoning all the justification for it in the original opinion. This is why, in some ways, Casey versus Planned Parenthood is far worse than Roe v. Wade. That's the legal background and the attempt on the part of the court at every stage of this debate to not deal with the question of human personhood. But ultimately, that is what's doing all the work. Let me give you examples of how you can sort of show this to people when you share your own pro-life views with them. I mean, imagine if you have this encounter. In fact, this is something that, it's a story that happened to me. 1988, I had just been hired at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, UNLV, and Michael Dukakis was running for president. Remember Michael Dukakis? He ran against George Bush. Remember him? Not gonna do it. Right, that's what he used to say. That's actually my impression of Dina Carvey impersonating George Bush. One of the things that Dukakis suggested in his platform or his policies was to fund prenatal care for women that needed it who couldn't afford it. At the same time, he was pro-choice on abortion. So I wrote an op-ed piece for the local paper. I just got hired. I was too naive and young to realize that I was writing something politically incorrect. I wrote this dialogue, actually modeled after the work of Peter Kraft. Some of you may know his work. And it was called Socrates Meets Dukakis. It's all Greek to me. And it's a dialogue as Socrates runs into Michael Dukakis and they debate this issue of abortion. And one of the questions that Socrates raises is, if in fact you believe that the fetus is so valuable that government should help women preserve its life if they want it, why, on the other hand, do you support the right to abortion, which says that it's worthless? It's an inconsistency. And so at the end, I think Socrates wins the argument, and the local paper published it. Well, my colleague, Craig Walton, who has since passed away, a dear friend, Craig was very strongly pro-choice, wrote a response in which George Bush dialogued with Socrates. And in this case, Socrates teaches George Bush that the pro-life position is wrong. And it was actually kind of it was in the days when colleagues who disagreed on these issues could have a friendly sort of bantering. Those days are unfortunately, sadly gone. But Craig, in his dialogue, this fictional dialogue, had Socrates make the argument that if abortion were made illegal, that only rich women would be able to have abortions. Which is an argument that you sometimes hear, that if Roe v. Wade is overturned, then there's a sort of inequity that would occur. And so what happened, I saw Craig in the hall, actually knocked on his door, saw him go into his office, and I said, I read your piece and your response to me. I said, I think it's really kind of neat that we can have this public debate. And he goes, oh, that's, I didn't agree with you, but I think it's good for the department. I said, I have a question though, Craig. I said, now, your argument based on the inequity of access to abortion if it becomes illegal. You must actually like the fact that now of crack cocaine in the inner city. He says, where'd that come from? I said, well, this is why, because prior to crack cocaine, only rich people could afford cocaine. Now poor people have full access to all the benefits of cocaine. You know? And he says, that's ridiculous, because that's bad. I go, ah. So the real question is not whether poor people have access to something that rich people have access to, but whether in fact it is a good. That is, the vices of the wealthy do not become virtues for the poor because they're denied them. I said, so what you've done, Craig, and he taught logic. I said, you beg the question. What's begging the question is to assume what you're trying to prove. That is, if the fetus is a person, then no justification is adequate. But if it isn't a person, you don't need those arguments. Think about it. If the fetus isn't a person, why would you have to defend abortion by using these arguments? Right? I mean, people don't do that for like appendectomies or tonsillectomies or anything like that. Nobody says, you know, appeals to these sort of, these emotional, sentimental arguments for those sorts of things, because we don't believe that your appendix or your tonsils are could be persons, right? So at the end of the day, these sorts of arguments that are usually deeply emotional and they do appeal to people's sense of fairness, ultimately assume that the fetus isn't a person. So this is the way, I think, the best way to look at this. Every time somebody offers you an argument like that, just ask yourself, could I apply this principle to a postnatal person? And if you can't, then the argument doesn't work, which gets you back to the issue. The important thing is to get people to get back to the issue. What is the nature of the unborn? Again, getting back to the issue of poor people that need access to abortion. Imagine if I were to respond to that, and this is in a debate years later. I debated another colleague, the dean of our social work school at UNLV on this, and she kind of gave the same argument. And I said, well, why can't a parent choose which child to execute? I mean, why the prenatal one? I mean, after all, the prenatal one has all her years ahead of her. Or, some of them have lived a couple years, and the parent may have a better sense of which one actually belongs on Earth. You know, maybe the prenatal one is like a do-over for one of the other ones. And she was stunned at this, and she goes, well, that would be murder. I said, so the real issue is whether the killing the unborn is unjustified. It's not whether their existence may deprive the parent of certain goods. Because you wouldn't apply that to the postnatal child. Again, begs the question. It assumes that the fetus is not a full-fledged member of the human community, which is precisely the issue. So every time, that's where you have to always ask yourself that question. All right. So let me say a few things. How much time do I have? A couple more, about 15, 20 more minutes.
20.
20. Oh, very good. Okay.
25 if you're good.
I'm looking for like a massive clock on the wall. I don't see it.
You've got a massive guy with a watch.
Okay, there you go. You're my conscience. So. Let me say a few things about a little bit about fetal development and why is it that people that are fully aware of these facts seem to, at the same time, support abortion rights. I mean, one of the things that sort of surprises many pro-life citizens, and it surprises actually a lot of my students at Baylor, who most of whom are pro-life, will be studying, let's say a philosopher who argues for abortion rights. And the thing that surprises them is that most of philosophers and bioethicists who defend abortion rights do not deny that the fetus is a human being. This surprises a lot of people. They think, well, all I need to do is show people the facts of fetal development and they'll be, absolutely persuaded. And for most ordinary citizens, that's really enough. It's to show them that the unborn is a human being and you are identical to your prenatal self. That's usually enough to... But philosophers, many of them who are pro-choice, will say that the unborn is a human being but not a person.